All right. Hi there. My name is Deborah. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a community organizer based in Texas, and I work with BLMP, which stands for Black LGBTQ Migrant Project. And specifically, we work with Black immigrants who are queer and trans and are dealing with what it means to give up your homeland, um, and what are some of the ways we can ensure liberation of all Black people. And to do that, we have local hubs where people organize around issues that are impacting them in their cities or regions. We also build international coalitions with working class people across the diaspora. We fight deportations and support people who are undergoing removal proceedings. And we're also here to challenge and shake up the homophobic, xenophobic, transphobic, racist, anti Black, um, capitalist world that imperialism has forced us to inherit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what imperialism has to do with the migrants of 2021. And in general, I just really want to thank and appreciate Delaware Valley University for uplifting this topic. It's something that often gets brushed over by perhaps mainstream um, immigrant justice or even racial justice movements that don't see what happens at the intersection of those those movements. And I think some of the best ways to approach such a messy system is through first person narratives. Two of the Black queer migrants who, um, I've been lucky to uh, organize with and be in contact with, went ahead and shared their narratives with me in writing. And so I want to read what they said, and then we'll kind of delve into um, what does the big picture mean. So I'm going to read first Mohammed's story. And he says, "My story is too long to put into a paragraph. I will just say that I am from West Africa, and I have spent the last 10 years in prison in the United States. After 4 years of detention in Alabama, ICE created, ICE is Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, ICE created fake travel documents in order to be able to deport me to a country where I am not a citizen. Prior to my removal, ICE moved me to an immigrant detention center in Louisiana, where I contracted COVID-19 two separate times. And by the time they put me on a plane to deport me, I was still testing positive. When I arrived in Africa, the immigration officials there arrested me because, again, I was not their citizen. I had to go into hiding so as to not be deported once again. I learned that me, as well, and some of the other 73 people on my flight were listed as cargo and did not have to have appropriate or sufficient documents, which is of course against the protocol that the immigration officials set forth. But this goes to show you the blatant um, disregard for any type of order or um, fairness in this system. They can do what they want. And really, when it comes to immigration officials, there's no one watching them. And often they're referred to as a rogue entity. I also want to share Nassim's story. Both of their names have been changed for their own safety and security. Um, Nassim is also a Black migrant. And he says, I left Ghana in the summer of 2018 after the police found me and my partner in bed. They killed him right in front of me because homosexuality is seen as a sin. I finally entered the United States in July of 2019, where I passed my credible fear interview. And I was subsequently detained in Texas for 10 months, awaiting my chance to apply for asylum. I was released with an ankle monitor because of my health risk factors for COVID-19. Little did I know that I would be detained again during my check-in with ICE in September of 2020. They wanted to deport me urgently. They pulled me out of my new cell 3 separate times in an attempt to force me to depart, but there was always something that saved me. To be free a second time 3 months later is unbelievable. I am full of so much fear that they will continue to play this game with my life. As you can see, for Nassim, who was recently detained in a migrant detention facility, he had no autonomy over his body. They pull you in and take you out when they see fit. There's very little rhyme or reason as to who and what, and they don't follow their own policy updates. So we're gonna get into why is it okay for ICE to exist and create such blatant oppression. So yeah, immigration, customs, and enforcement is not necessarily unique in its oppression. It exists because, much like policing in general, the two of those are both strongholds of the imperialist project, and they function to terrorize working class people, in particular, you know, Black, queer, and trans migrants, women, and the root of both of these institutions is due to an effort to sustain the global power that the United States has. And that's because of imperialism. Imperialism is a global system whereby the dominant political and economic interests of one nation expropriate for their own enrichment the land, labor, and raw materials and markets of another people or of another nation. So that is truly the root of why ICE exists, why policing in its current state exists. For as long as imperialism continues to have a stronghold, there will always be migrants, as imperialism causes displacement from other nations. So when the United States creates hybrid wars or enforces sanctions, or, you know, even real wars, this forces society and other countries to destabilize. It forces governments to destabilize. When the United States coordinates with the CIA to, you know, bring down another sovereign nation because the United States thinks they know best for that country, that causes people to flee those areas. And, you know, there's also things, you know, there's multinational corporations that are displacing people from their homelands. For example, in Central America, you have the Garifuna people, and particularly in Honduras, what we're seeing is ecotourism is displacing native Black people. They're called Garifuna, and they had been there for hundreds of years. But because the coastline is now able to be purchased by anyone who's interested in developing that area, adding condos and tourist attractions, it means the people who've had that land passed down to them for centuries are now being forced to migrate elsewhere. Sometimes that means to major cities, and other times that means out of the country. And there are so many examples of that. And if it's not ecotourism, then it's drone strikes. And if it's not drone strikes, then it's extreme sanctions. And if it's not those, then it's global warming, forcing people to experience environmental disasters that then displaces them. And so all of these um, all of these parts of imperialism have caused forced migration of people from across the globe into the US. And while, some things are so much more complicated than just US intervention or, yeah, some things are a lot more gray area, but we have seen some of the primary causes of forced migration have been due to imperialism. And in particular, for LGBTQIA plus migrants, folks are coming from countries that had formerly been colonized. And a lot of the countries, when they established their independence, didn't necessarily take on an entirely new constitution or an entirely new code. Some things trickled down, particularly language about or around carnal knowledge, essentially homosexuality, and any type of gender variation has been criminalized in the colonies, and those were passed down even past independence. So we have seen that also forcing people to leave their homes due to homophobic and transphobic violence. So that is, I always feel like if I'm going to talk about what's going on here, I have to situate it in how it came to be, because people often believe that migrants from across the world are coming to the U.S. to have access to the American dream, and the reality is that they're really fleeing from an American nightmare and having to come here because this is where all of their home country's wealth and resources have been expropriated to, again, because of imperialism. And so for a lot of people, it's about regaining access to stability and not feeling afraid for their lives. And we know that immigration, customs, and enforcement is not a necessary institution for this country's continued survival. It's a teenager in terms of its existence. It's only about 18 years old or something, and was created as a response to 9/11, and it was the first time we saw the combination or the merging of the enforcement aspect of immigration, so the policing, the detention, the deportation side, merging with the affirmative side, or the side that determines people's legal status. So they kind of all merged under the Department of Homeland Security, and we see them do what we see local police departments do, state troopers, the ERO, the FBI, the CIA, all of them have negatively impacted poor and working class communities in particular, um, both here and across the world. And I say that again because um, whether it's military bases or even ICE has hundreds of offices across the world. And so it's not just that they're based here in the US. And all of this lends to um, these entities being extensions of the imperialist project. So it's really important that we look at patterns. Um, Anytime, deportation or jail or imprisonment has been leveraged against people, both here and abroad, it's been because people are trying to um, improve their lives. So, for example, if you have workers at a factory, let's say Amazon, who are striking in order to get better conditions at their workplace, who are the first people to break their picket lines and force them to go back to work, so that they can continue filling their, billionaire bosses' pockets? It's the police. The police are always there to show up and get people back to work and um, arrest anybody who um, has been protesting. And then when families across the United States are evicted because they can't afford to pay their rent, who who is supposed to come there um, and throw their possessions outside, place padlocks on the door, just to protect a house, an empty brick and mortar house? It's the police. They show up and they padlock your doors and they kick you out of your home. And you know when people, like this past summer, we saw thousands of people mobilize in the streets to demand justice for George Floyd, and the hundreds of other Black folks who have been harmed by um, state violence, by police brutality. Who were the people that came in unmarked cars, who sent out their drones, um, ran people over with their horses? I mean, we heard all the stories. The first people to these scenes, of course, were the police. Um, and so it's the continued impunity of these forces has shown us that when we try to push for change or reform these institutions, they they're going to continue to harm us. And whether the progress that's made is in the form of banning certain weapons or taking some of their money or just training them better or increasing the diversity at their respective institution, um, or giving them more body cameras. We've seen time and time again that they continue to kidnap us, to detain us, to extort us, to injure us, and to even kill us. Um, so it begins to confuse us. Wait a minute. I mean, I thought law enforcement maintains law and order, whether it's immigration and customs enforcement, border patrol, or if it's, the state police, the state troopers, or the local police. And we're constantly having to ask ourselves, law and order, but for who? And order doesn't actually mean, oh, I went and destabilized your country, which gave you no option other than to migrate here. So, I'm going to find a way to, make this right and stop harming you and your people. That's not what order is. Order doesn't even mean like quality healthcare, education, housing, jobs for all in the United States. Um, when they say law and order, they specifically mean um, across the board denials of, parole for Black migrants, or it means solitary confinement for Black migrants, especially trans migrants. Law and order for them means, they can detain you without cause. They can remove you without cause, without allowing you your rights. And it means if you get sick in jail, in prison, in detention centers, they can just give you a Tylenol and be done with you, and ignore um, long-term, serious grave conditions that end up getting worse while you're detained. Um, Law and order to them means, let me just deport this migrant, even though they're fleeing for their life and um, are in need of, refuge. So it's really important to situate any of our work on immigration within that context, within the framework of imperialism, um, and capitalism being two of the biggest entities that then force migrants from their homelands into this settler state. And then this settler state has the audacity to say, you can stay, you can't stay. And it bases that on, racism. It bases that on this idea that it has the right to determine on stolen land who does and does not get to be here. So I really think that that's when we talked about Nassim and Mohammed and the thousands of migrants who have stories similar to theirs, it's important to understand the context in which the imperialism makes you feel powerless. Yes, these systems are racist. Sure, people, are profiting off of every single body's detention and deportation, but ultimately it's to, preserve the interests of this imperialist power, the United States. And that's why it can do what it does. It's also really important to understand, when we talk about abolition, we're talking about eliminating, imprisonment, policing, and surveillance that are in the service of imperialism, and creating systems that are alternatives to what we see as punishment and imprisonment now. It's understanding what are the roots of migration and not just criminalizing people for migrating. One of the highest concentration of migrants have in the last 2 years in particular have been people from Cameroon. And what we're seeing happening there is that their country is undergoing a crisis that has its roots in imperialist domination, and the way that that country was carved up by all the colonial powers. So, back in colonial days, you had the scramble for Africa, and in the land that is currently called Cameroon, you had English speaking colonial powers, but you also had French speaking colonial powers. And at some point, you even had German speaking colonial powers in that one land. And so the French and the British in particular divided Cameroon up into separate spheres of influence. And then the imperialist League of Nations which came before the United Nations, went ahead and said, yes, that's official. This is going to be English speaking territory, and this is going to be French speaking territory. And the French side of Cameroon was much larger and was eventually granted independence in 1960. And then shortly after, about a year after, you saw the independence of the British colony. And there was obviously a lot of, well, we want to be a part of this other country, and land disputes internally. But you also ultimately had Cameroon comprised of the colonial subjects of these two different countries, and so there was really a setback in justice. They didn't start from an equal playing field and just start, harming each other because they had different languages that they spoke. People began to see a power indifference between how, who got to hold office and who owned the different institutions and the corporations, between the two different colonial subjects. And that caused a lot of strife. And over the decades, that got stronger and stronger until it erupted into a civil war. And that has caused hundreds, if not thousands, of Cameroonian migrants to be detained here in the United States under ICE custody. And these Cameroonian migrants in the last year, many of them have not been given any updates on their case. They're just sitting in tiny detention cells. And so, unaware of what will come of their case and if they have proven that they deserve asylum. And again, they're begging for approval for asylum in a country that is a settler nation. It's just a huge irony that somebody else gets to come in and govern who does not get to stay here when they're not the true arbiters of this land. And by they, of course, I'm talking about the general immigrant or immigration system. So what do you see? You see dozens and dozens of strikes in detention centers across the country. People started refusing to eat, refusing to take orders, because they wanted to demand an end to what they thought was an indefinite detention. And that's even for people who, did all the right things and had their credible fear interviews approved. And left and right, they're seeing asylum denials. They're appealing and still getting denied. They're denied to even be out on parole while their case is being litigated or while their case is pending. And so, of course, this is really important to understand, again, the connection between imperialism and migration now, specifically for Black migrants. And when we look into these prisons, the ones that, Nassim and Mohammed talked about briefly, we see that since the beginning of ICE, more than 200 people have died in custody. And just in the fiscal year 2020, we saw 21 people die, lose their lives in ICE detention, either because they became very ill, they were malnourished, they had all sorts of extenuating circumstances. And it's because of the negligence of immigration customs and enforcement. And we don't need it to exist. People could have just been out fighting their cases. There was no need to detain them. But because the people who are detained are seen, for one, as, profitable, but for two, as leverage. So if a country has done something to upset the United States could say, "Hey, we've got 200 of your people. We're sending them back," or um, other kinds of leverages that are threats. And so when it comes to who is going to get approved and not approved, um, we're looking at, let's see. So when we look at the asylum decisions between 2012 and 2017, we see that Haitians actually had the second highest denial rate at 87%. And in the year before that, you had Jamaicans with the highest asylum denial rate. So folks, if they express that they have fear for one of the categories for asylum, we're still seeing people getting denied asylum, particularly migrants from Black countries, Black migrants. Um, and so it's not just that the detention centers here are horrid, it's that even for folks who are going through the detention system, have spent time waiting, going through the judicial system, are still being denied at insane rates. 87% is just extraordinarily high for denials. And, you also saw Somali people have one of the highest asylum denial rates in the same time period. And they are they also had the highest rate of deportation. Somali people did. So you see this like very explicit targeting of Black migrants, particularly people from countries that the U.S. has, either lost interest or alternative interests, and yeah, don't feel uh, any type of way about removing people to dangerous situations, putting them into dangerous situations. So uh, in 2020, additionally, we saw that more than 43 women reported that they underwent non-consensual or medically unnecessary gynecological procedures while detained at the Irwin County Detention Center in Georgia. And ICE was trying desperately to deport these women so that they wouldn't tell their stories about having had these procedures um, to done on them without their consent, without their full knowledge of what was going on. And that is the type of negligence we see. Forced surgical procedures on Black migrants, forced solitary confinement, um, for which I actually also have an example or an anecdote. One of our members, Zaza, was detained for almost a decade, and there were entire chunks of that decade where she, a trans woman from Jamaica, was put in solitary confinement. So that meant she only had 1 hour, sometimes once a week, to be outside of her tiny, tiny cell. That can be extremely damaging for a person's psyche. And I'm no psychologist and no doctor, but given that we're social beings, this is obviously super harmful. And she's expressed it time and time again how she wasn't sure how she would get out of detention alive and, with her sanity intact. Um, so when we talk about racism in immigration detention centers or prisons, we also know that it's important for us to highlight that while um, of all the people in detention, uh, Black migrants only represent about 4%, and that's people from Africa or the Caribbean. Um, And so even though they're only representing 4%, they actually represent 24% of all solitary confinement lockups. And that's exactly the experience that Zaza had in California and Colorado, and other people continue to see. Um, we also know that ICE is 22% more likely to record a disciplinary infraction as a reason for placing a person from an African nation in solitary confinement as compared to other detained people. And then it's like, even when folks are eligible to get out, so they've been given a bond, um, Black migrants are given some of the highest average bond amounts. We've seen them as high as $200,000, and you cannot pay a portion. It has to be in full. Um, we've seen bonds averaged at $16,700 just for Haitian immigrants, which is 54% higher than for other immigrants. And we also know that, that's children too. Children, between January and March of last year, 29% of the families detained here in Texas at a jail called Karnes County uh, Residential Center. 29% of the families there were Haitian. And as COVID-19 progressed, many people were released on ankle monitors. However, the Haitian families were who were left behind. So they jumped to 44% of the entire total at that detention center. And that's a family detention center, which means people's kids are kept there with them. So, that gives you an idea of what, in general, these detention centers look like. And yes, COVID has obviously made things worse, because ICE's handling of the pandemic has led to over 7,000 reported positive cases, and at least 8 coronavirus related deaths among detained people. And we saw between May of 2020 and August 1st, there was a report that found that ICE was responsible for over 245,000 COVID-19 cases throughout the country. So that didn't just mean detainees. Um, that meant the entire ICE network. So all the people they hired to work in these detention centers, the guards, the custodial staff, the people who drove people from place to place, from detention center to detention center, and all of the doctors and nurses and food servers who are associated with ICE, who then went home to their families and their churches and their schools, and kept, spreading COVID, that amounted to about 245,000 cases throughout the country. Um, and that's why you saw over 2,000 people join in COVID-19 related hunger strikes. People were scared. They were not receiving any information about how they could truly protect themselves. And when certain media entities and politicians would inquire what's going on, um, they would clean up, give everyone gloves and, a couple, maybe a bar of soap, some pumps of hand sanitizer, and say, look, everybody has a mask. But the reality is that it is impossible to socially distance when there's 40 people to a quad or a dorm. It's physically impossible when you've got triple bunk beds and people layered on top of each other to stay socially distanced. And that's why you saw 245,000 cases created by ICE. Um, and, for the detained people, that meant, over 7,000. And that's as of November of last year. Certainly the number has shot up and since then. but easily over 7,000 positive cases, um, and only 62,000 people had been tested. So, frankly, there was, you know, the 7,000 positive cases is probably a low catch. A lot of people reported having symptoms, but not having been tested until their symptoms had passed. And so, we saw states like California, Texas, Arizona had the most number of COVID-19 cases. Um, and that came solely from the workers at the ICE detention facilities, bringing them to the detained people. And so, how then are we in solidarity with with immigrants, with migrants? Um, I think it's really important to understand always what context um, people are fleeing their homelands with. I definitely think that's a big aspect of this, because otherwise people project and say, oh, you're so lucky. You're so lucky to be one of the ones who left, or isn't it great to have access to the American dream? Um, and it feels uh, like a savior type thing if you don't understand how imperialism lent itself to creating these like disparities and mass migrations and caravans. Um, and then once you can at least acknowledge that, imperialism has had an impact, um, and the US military continues to, extend imperialism, um, forcing people to migrate, then you have to understand how, once people are here, anti-Blackness from immigration attorneys, from the judges, from the ICE officers creates a whole new host of issues. Um, and our claims for asylum, as y'all saw in the numbers, aren't taken as seriously. When we say, we were harassed by police, or we were attacked by someone in our village for having whatever identity we have, our stories are less likely to be believed across the board. Um, you also, um, once you can understand that, this, even the positive sides of immigration that are, supposedly trying to help migrants um, stay here, there's racism embedded and anti-Blackness embedded in that as well. And we see that through the way Black migrants are criminalized, the way that there's a good versus bad Black migrant, um, or good versus bad migrant um, dynamic that's forced on people. Um, there's also so that's another way to help people, other than understanding how um, ICE is racist, how the immigration justice system in general is racist, how imperialism impacts migrants or people across the world. It's also really important to challenge in the media, in your organizations, in your workplaces, in your communities, and your families, the good versus bad immigrant narrative, um, because that's what allows um, the state to continue neglecting the basic rights of migrants, because they'll say, well, these people didn't do things the right way, and so they're going to get what's coming to them. And when people buy into that narrative, we see huge human rights violations across the board. um, if there's an organization near you, um, it's a great, particularly a Black-led organization that also supports immigrants. um, it's really important that um, you maybe share funding opportunities with them, or find other ways to be in solidarity with their work. And if possible, challenge people who have perhaps like nationalist ideals. A lot of times, um, there's people who believe that, the only real Black people are um, those who are descendants of slavery. And again, that's another way to further divide what actually could be um, a billion strong Black community, one that understands who our real oppressors are and doesn't allow for people to point the finger at each other. So, yeah, specifically, if you're a Black person in any, whether you're in academia, or social justice or nonprofit world, there's so much space to challenge um, anti-migrant sentiments, um, and certainly to challenge, homophobia and transphobia. Um, the other thing that's really important for us to take away is undermining uh, tactics that we might not fully understand or agree with. It can be super dangerous. We never, if someone is pushing for the overall progress of society and not for any, entity within the working class to be harmed, then we shouldn't judge them for the way that they choose to fight for justice or change. So, I see that so much, particularly in the immigrant justice movement. Oh, what they're doing is too much. We need to, um, all be better citizens and show that we're better Americans or good Americans, and um, that's a very dangerous narrative to buy into. Um, Also, I think the most important thing for all of us is to understand that the courts, the lawmakers, the attorneys, the executive offices, um, none of them will bring permanent change. Um, and none of them will stop migration from happening. Migration is um, inherent to humanity, and forced migration, however, is not. And that will continue to exist for as long as imperialism exists. So the two parts in that are: one, don't chalk up all the answers to, oh, the elected officials will take care of that, the Supreme Court will take care of that. That's never the case in history. Um, we, the people who are directly impacted by these systems, are who challenge and agitate and organize to um, keep such an oppressive force from existing. And if we don't want to see, mass caravans and mass migrations, then we can't also simultaneously entertain imperialism, because the two are so closely linked. I think I have come to an end of my discussion about Black migrants and the detention to deportation pipeline. Of course, this is an overview. This is by no means um, a immigration law class. I would not attempt to teach that. But I am really grateful for anybody who's interested in learning how to advocate for Black migrants. My contact information will be below. And I really wanted to give thanks to everybody who made Delaware Valley University's Women's Summit possible. I'm very happy to be talking, as a woman, um, and yeah, uplifting the importance of advocating for and understanding the context within which Black migrants exist. So I hope everybody has a good rest of their evening. Again, feel free to comment your questions. I promise to check back and see if there's been any feedback on the video. I hope everybody has a good one. Thank you for listening, and bye.